Managing cognitive load. Previously, we learned that cognitive load is the sum of all information being processed through our working memory. We've also seen that the total cognitive load originates from three sources. Now that we have an idea of what cognitive load is and where it comes from, we can look for ways of reducing the cognitive load inherent in our media designs. Some cognitive load is necessary for learning to take place, so it can never be completely eliminated, but we can at least try to make learning as effortless as possible for our learners. Avoiding split attention. Unnecessary cognitive load can result when the learner is required to split their attention between two separate media elements at once. For instance, if two visual elements are presented at one time, the learner can only dedicate their visual attention on one element at a time. This situation often appears in instructional media when text content is accompanied by graphics. The learner must read the text and then hold that information in their working memory as they shift their attention to the graphic. The textual information must be quickly encoded to long-term memory as the attention shifts, or else it may be lost due to decay. Contiguity. The effects of this split attention effect can be reduced by clearly associating the two media elements. If the designer were to position the text in close proximity to the graphic, the connection between the two would be more easily apparent. The close association between the text and imagery is called contiguity. Our brains have a natural tendency to look for patterns and connections. Consider what is shown here. Are you able to see the image of a dog walking slightly away from you as it sniffs the ground? Just in case, here is a hint. Strictly speaking, the dog does not exist in the image. What is seen is actually a series of black shapes on a white background. But, in an effort to make sense of the image, our brain connects the dots and recognizes the pattern of the dog. A similar phenomenon occurs in our instructional media. Pieces of closely associated visual and verbal information are actually interpreted as a single unit. The result is a reduced overall load upon our working memory. The verbal element can take the form of either text or audio. If text appears with a corresponding graphic, the two must be positioned close to one another on the screen for the association to be clear. This is known as spatial contiguity, referring to the space between the two. For audio narration, the presentation of images should be synchronized with the spoken words so that each concept is visually represented as it is mentioned in the audio. This is temporal contiguity, meaning contiguity based on timing. Establishing these close associations helps to prevent the viewer's attention from being split. They are no longer asked to hold one element in memory as they shift to the other. Instead, both can be attended to together. Modality. While both text and audio are capable of effectively conveying verbal information, research has shown audio narration to be preferable to text when graphics are present. The reason for this is that text and graphics are both visual media. No matter how closely the two are associated on the screen, there will always be a slight splitting of attention between the two as the learner shifts their eyes from one to the other. This issue is eliminated if the verbal content is delivered as narration. The learner can listen to the instructional content while freely examining the visualization of the ideas described. There is no competition between the words and graphics. Instead, the two complement one another perfectly. A further recommendation is that the content should not be repeated as redundant text on the screen. The reasons for avoiding redundant text are twofold. First, the on-screen text can draw the learner's attention away from the graphics. Ideally, the graphics are perfectly synchronized with the audio narration. If the learner is attempting to read the text while the graphics are shown, important visual details may be missed. The second reason is the possibility of competing verbal content. Remember that our memory system processes information through two channels, a visual channel and an auditory channel. The auditory channel deals with speech and language use, regardless of whether it appears as text or narration. Even though text and audio are taken in through different senses, both are processed in the auditory channel. Even if the wording of the text and audio is identical, they are still separate audio inputs that compete for valuable processing power. As a result, there is a tendency for the two to confound one another, preventing either from being clearly understood. The solution is that we either use text or audio narration to deliver our lesson, but not both at once. And audio narration is the preferable modality since it easily complements any on-screen graphics. Eliminating extraneous media. Most of the extraneous cognitive load stems from the inefficient use of media to deliver our instructional message. All too often, unnecessary bells and whistles can make their way into our designs, adding to the overall amount of mental input experienced by the learner. Extraneous audio. Sounds can be highly beneficial in our lessons, but sounds can also detract from a lesson's effectiveness if used in excess. Beeps and pings that activate anytime a button is clicked or moused over can become a nuisance. This can be especially problematic if the sounds are overly loud and run the risk of drowning out any narration playing at the time. A similar issue occurs when ambient or environmental sounds are included. For instance, if the media portrays an outdoor scene that features chirping birds and blowing wind, such sounds can distract or irritate learners and potentially overshadow any narration. A third source of extraneous audio is the use of music. Music is commonly used in instructional media as a way of gaining the learner's attention or to set the tone for lesson content. But if the volume is not managed properly, the music can drown out the instructor's voice. The learner can potentially miss valuable lesson content as a result. The recommended approach is to avoid including extraneous sounds and music in our media design. Unless a sound effect directly supports understanding of the subject matter, it's best that it be omitted. Theme music is best limited to introductions and closing titles. Fading the music out as the lesson begins helps prevent any conflict between the media elements. Extraneous visuals. Our visual channel is susceptible to cognitive load as well, with extraneous visuals monopolizing the limited capacity of our working memory. It is tempting to include eye-catching visuals in the hopes of capturing the viewer's attention. But from a learning standpoint, these extraneous graphics impair the understanding of the more relevant content. As we saw earlier, it is a natural tendency to make mental connections between closely associated elements. Ideally, our verbal content should be closely associated with the meaningful graphics. That association helps to create a more complete picture of the lesson concepts. If verbal content is associated with the irrelevant graphics instead, it becomes more challenging for the learner to gain an accurate impression of what is being communicated. If a visual is simply not needed to communicate a particular piece of content, it's usually best to go without the accompanying graphic rather than throwing in an image just to fill space. Extraneous content. An additional source of potential extraneous cognitive load comes from the lesson content itself. While composing our lessons, it may be tempting to insert interesting but unessential side notes or anecdotes or technical details related to the subject matter. This is a natural inclination since we are all likely experts on the subjects we teach and have knowledge and experience to share. The issue again comes down to the limits on the cognitive resources available for handling information. Tying up those resources with non-essential details is a detriment to learning. The determining factor for deciding the relevance of information is to ask whether that information directly supports the learning objectives set forth for the lesson. If the details being shared do not move the learner closer to the stated goals, then it is best to consider omitting that information from the lesson.